Hey everyone, today we are continuing on in our series in Acts. Obviously we've still got the bottles on, they're still going. And today we see that Paul travels back to Jerusalem, and on the way he stops at all these different places. So last week we spoke about how he'd started off and he'd gone from through Macedon down to Greece, and then so Athens, that kind of thing, and then had gone to Miletus to speak to the elders from Ephesus. So he'd done that trip so far. So a bit of a missionary journey and kind of heading back to Jerusalem. And then our chapter, so we're chapter 21. Read it if you can. You can easily read it in a week. Chapter 21, Paul is heading back through the different places. So it's a lot of logistics. Luke does kind of record for us the stuff they did. So there's things that happened and there's what goes on. But Paul does a lot of stuff, and Luke records what Paul does. Luke records the things that they did. Luke records that they went to this city and picked up this person and dropped them off and went to this, and that kind of stuff. So there's logistics there. But what we can see in that as they're traveling around is it's not just random. It's not just, and then we went to this market because we wanted to have some soup, and then we went there because it was the fastest port or anything like that. It's places that Paul had been, and he's going through. So if you can imagine, he knows he's going back to Jerusalem. Now, remember, we moved Jerusalem over here because we needed kind of baptistry space and stuff like that. He's going back to Jerusalem. But rather than just kind of going straight there, he's actually kind of taken a bit of a route. He's going through all these different places, and he's talking with the churches there, and he's encouraging them. Now, he as from last week, he has a kind of an understanding of what's going to happen. He kind of gets where things are going for him. He's already said to the Ephesians he's probably going to be back. And he's probably aware that people might be a bit discouraged by what happens to him or what he thinks might happen to him. Maybe he goes, just to be sure, this is probably the last time I'm going to see them in person. I kind of know what I'm doing here. I know what God's got for me, got in store for me, where I'm going to go, and I probably won't be back here. And so he spends his time going through and encouraging them and kind of pumping them up before he gets to Jerusalem. He gets to Jerusalem and he's confronted by some people who go, hey, look, we've heard everything. I mean, he explains the gospel, what he's been doing, that stuff's been happening in the Gentiles, and people are like, hey, that's great. Just letting you know there's some people who are a bit concerned. You're saying to Jews that they shouldn't be getting circumcised and they should break the religious laws and should break Moses' laws and all that kind of stuff. And so as an act of purification, so to show that that's not what you're doing, why don't you do the purification thing? So shave your head, kind of do the stuff that very clearly says, no, anything that might be impure, I'm purifying myself so I can go worship in the temple. You know, Paul was Jewish, so it wouldn't be crazy for him to do that. He was following those things. He just was saying that Gentiles didn't need to. That's what Paul was saying. So that's a really interesting point for us to work through, that Paul as a Jew was happy following Jesus and doing some Jewish things, doing the things that he knew and had been brought up doing as an act of worship to God, because he knew that God was the same God. But then for Gentiles who were following Jesus, still God, he went, well, you don't need to do that because that's a law thing. And if we tell you that you must do that, then it's works, not grace. Whereas Paul was doing it because that's probably what he'd always done and out of an act of worship. So it wasn't works-based for Paul, it was as a response. But it's kind of a bit of a side note. While he's there, though, stuff happens. So Paul goes, he's in Jerusalem, he's hanging out in Jerusalem, and he's in the temple, and he's shaved his head, so he's doing the stuff that says, I'm purifying myself, I have been purified, this is all good. You know, I should be okay to be here. And then he's in Jerusalem. And then there's some Jews from the province of Asia we hear, which is Ephesus. They find Paul in Jerusalem and they get super upset with him and they basically start a riot. They stir up trouble. They get a whole bunch of people to kind of mob around him and they're beating him up. It's not the, hey, you've done the wrong thing, get out. It's, hey, you've done the wrong thing, we're going to try to kill you. So Paul's in Jerusalem, he's being beaten up, and while he's there, and while this is all happening, the kind of Roman centurions and guard come, because their job is at policing as well as kind of soldiers. Their job is to police, and so they rock up, because obviously someone is being beaten up, there's a bit of a riot, that's not on. So there's stuff that goes on. So I'm going to read for a little bit, and then we talk a little bit more. When the 7 days was nearly over, so that's the purification thing, some Jews from the province of Asia, that's the Ephesus bit, saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law and this place. And besides, he's brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen Trophimus, the Ephesian, in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple. The whole city was aroused and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple and immediately the gates were shut. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul. The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another, and since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great that he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him." As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied. "Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago?" Paul answered, "I'm a Jew from Tarsus in Cilicia, a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people." After receiving the commander's permission, Paul stood on the steps and motioned to the crowd. Now, Paul is threatened with violence. Paul is in chains and he's taken up and he speaks to the commander. Now, the commander clearly, he's a centurion, so he's Italian, and he's looking at the Jews and the Egyptians and going, "You're all the same to me." That's basically what he says. "Aren't you the Egyptian?" I mean, Paul is clearly Jewish, but aren't you the Egyptian? And Paul's like, "No, that's not me. I'm not being beaten up for that. I don't, that's not me at all. I'm from Tarsus." And so Paul speaks in Greek to him, probably because Paul could. But to the crowd he turns and he speaks to the crowd. Now, we're going to get into what he says next week. But Paul has taken this opportunity to speak. So Paul is in danger. There are people who aren't happy with him. There are people who want to beat him up. The commander is there. And rather than kind of shying away from what he needs to say, Paul takes this opportunity to speak to the crowd once he is safe. So even though, Paul is in Jerusalem and he's done everything right. There's people from Ephesus, and remember with Ephesus there was Diomedes, something like that, a silversmith, can't remember his name. You'll remember it better because you probably will have watched it more recently than I've done the talk. Stirs up trouble. Silversmith, anyway, stirs up trouble because obviously idol worship's gone down, him selling idols has gone down. So he's cranky, and people from there, Jews from there, come to Jerusalem and complain about Paul. But rather than shying away from it and kind of going into a shell, Paul is going to, and we'll look at that next week, take the opportunity to share again with the crowd. Now, that's a scary situation. I'm sure it was a scary situation. These people had just beaten Paul up. Now, the thing is Paul is wanting to tell them the gospel. Paul is wanting them to hear the good news. Even these people who are quite literally his enemies. I think that's a bit of a challenge. If you're a follower of Jesus, then it's a bit of a challenge for us that sometimes we can get stuck in that, I don't like them, they don't like me, they were mean to me, they were cruel to me, they were harsh to me, so I don't want them to know about Jesus. I don't want them to know about how good Jesus is, because the fear we might have is, but what if they believe? They were mean to me, they were cruel to me, they were harsh to me. If they believe in Jesus, they're forgiven, but I want them to be punished. That's something we've got to work through, because Paul has just been beaten by these people, and yet he's going to take the opportunity to share them the gospel. I'm going to leave us with that challenge. Who in your life is the person that you kind of has done wrong by you? And maybe that you have to think about, if I got the chance to share the gospel with them, would I? Kind of out of spite so that they don't receive salvation. It's a challenge for us because we've got to work through that, because we've got to share the gospel with everyone, because we were enemies of God and yet he showed us grace. So we should do the same. Have a great week.